Ret Paladin has been reworked again, all to accommodate the new hero talents, Templar and Herald of the Sun, which I have played on the alpha, and I'm going to be bringing them to you so you know what to expect and if Red is a class you would like to play in War Within, and what exactly are the hero talents that you will pick. Will it be Templar? Will it be Herald? Well, let's actually talk about the rework first, because a lot of people are gonna be, well, why is Red reworked again, man? Listen, just to kind of preface this for all classes and specs and any comments that will follow this, probably all classes will get some version of a rework to make way for the hero talents to be put into the game, to reduce friction, to make them be able to be built into proper builds so you don't really feel stuck and annoyed that you have to pick certain talents. That aside, there are a couple of things that are actually good for being addressed as far as reworks are concerned, and it does show that the devs are listening. Starting off really quick with the mastery. Mastery has changed. On top of actually being a bit stronger by default, the general percentage has been increased, it will also feature an extra effect, and that effect will come as a package deal with the new name for the mastery. Previously it was Hand of Light, now it will be called Mastery High Lord's Judgment, which will also make Judgment have a chance to blast the target with light, dealing holy damage. This is to make Mastery as an incentive to be geared towards and give you more options in terms of secondary stats, plus crit has also been addressed, and the general philosophy behind crits is that you want crits to be a valuable stat, but since you got guaranteed crits from different talents, now those are going to be changed, where critting actually does something more than just actually having a higher chance to crit. And you will see a lot of changes throughout the talent tree as to how this is going to be implemented. I'm not going to go into all of them because it is quite a few of them, and we're going to be sitting here all day, not to mention that because it is alpha, a lot of this could be changed, some tuning knobs could be modified, and feedback is always going to influence how you are going to be getting these talents once the game launches. But the general philosophy is that you will probably say bye-bye to versatility, or at least that is the plan. Whether or not that comes to fruition, we will see. As part of also the rework, there are a lot of other talents that have been changed, of course, but two that I really want to mention is, first of all, Wake of Ashes has been kind of changed slightly. The damage that it does is a little bit lower, but Truth's Wake has been baked into the basic effect of the ability, and instead of Truth's Wake as a capstone, you now have Burnt Ash. And what Burnt Ash does is when Truth's Wake critically strikes, that I mentioned before, its duration is extended by 2 seconds. Your other damage over time effects deal 30% increased damage to targets affected by Truth's Wake. We're talking about Expurgation as the currently only other damage over time effect that Retribution has, unless you're going to be talented into Herald of the Sun, which adds some more damage over time. Obviously, this is probably good on its own, but it will double dip into its value once you do decide to not be a Templar for whatever reason. And the other talent that I wanted to address, because this has to be one of the coolest things that Retribution can do now, is Divine Hammer. What is Divine Hammer? Is it that thing I never picked because it was so bad? Yes, it is that thing, which is as a choice note with Consecrated Blade, aka we don't like Consecration, so let's just get something else instead. Now Divine Hammer still replaces Consecration, and it is now a 2-minute cooldown. Ooh. It costs 1 holy power to be cast, and this is your Breath of Sindragosa. And if you're not a Frost Death Knight player, let me tell you what this does. This spins hammers around you, because that is part of the Paladin fantasy, and it is actually really cool. It looks really cool. It does damage around you, and it consumes holy power as it is active, and it will keep being active so long as it can still consume holy power, aka you will feed holy power into its effect to extend its duration, which is pretty cool as a concept. We'll see how it plays out. As a side effect, while it is active, your Judgment, Blade of Justice, and Crusader Strike recharge 75% faster and increase the rate at which Divine Hammer strikes by 15% when they are cast. It deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets, so it's kind of soft cap at 8, which is probably better since Red is usually soft cap at 5 targets, and it makes your generators come back off cooldown way quicker to kind of offset the fact that it consumes holy power. Now, gameplay implications could be huge because obviously as opposed to Breath of Sindragosa for Frost Death Knight, you'll still want to use finishers while this is up. It doesn't do tremendous amount of damage and it doesn't consume holy power fast enough for it to be the only way to consume that holy power. You'll still want to cast Divine Storms in AoE or Templar's Verdict or Final Verdict in single target. Now, how you juggle this will become interesting because you do have the other talent which has been played so far, Vanguard of Justice, that makes your finishers cost 1 additional holy power and deal more damage. Now, that's probably never going to be played with Divine Hammer if Divine Hammer becomes baseline or, you know, part of your kit, because you just won't have the economy sufficiently high enough to be able to cast all of these holy power spenders and still maintain Divine Hammer. This is a really interesting way to add some complexity to Ret and a little bit of depth. Now, this is all assuming that Divine Hammer actually becomes an ability that you want to play, since a lot of Ret's identity revolves around procs and things, and is there room enough to fit this into your kit? We will see. And one bigger thing that happened that is not necessarily in the Ret kit but in the class tree, which has seen very few changes, but one that it did change was Greater Judgment, which still does the same, but it now can overlap and it can apply multiple stacks because there is a particular talent that has changed in the Ret kit, which is High Lord's Wrath. Previously, I think it was High Lord's Judgment. And now what this does is your mastery, High Lord's Judgment, is 50% or 100% if you put both points in, more effective on Judgment and Hammer of Wrath. More importantly, Judgment applies an additional stack of Greater Judgment if it is known, meaning that finally, you'll probably have all of your consumers be able to benefit from the 20% increase in damage, and being able to fit that into your rotation will make the difference between an experienced and properly played Ret and somebody who's average, I would imagine. Which is great because this will also come into function when you are playing Templar. More on that in a second. Because we do have to thank the sponsors of our video, our Patreons, who are making a lot of this possible, keeping the lights up here at Marcelian&Online and making it a reality for us to cover so many alpha classes and more to come in the future. If you like our content and you want to support us a little bit more because YouTube revenue is kind of unreliable, to be fair, consider checking our Patreon page. It's down below. Of course, every support goes into making cooler videos, higher quality, more content in the future as well, and you'll have access to certain goodies like custom 4K wallpaper with your character on it, and monthly bloopers and Patreon podcasts talking about all the things Marcelian&Online. Plus, you'll be supporting the content. We appreciate it very much. And with that, let's talk about Templar, which is probably the cooler one of the two talent trees in name and in visuals, let's say, because we'll get to Herald of the Sun in a second. Now, I have to also once again preface this: the visuals for pretty much all of the hero talents that we've tested for more classes to come in the future are not very big. They don't change much. Honestly, I would like them to change a little bit more, but they don't at the moment. Now, we don't know if that is because this is just the alpha. Maybe they have some spell effects planned up until the game's release to kind of oomph the visual effects of hero talents, because some of them don't really feel heroic. But that aside, I do have to mention that some of the coolest things for Templar are the Imperium hammers that keep raining from the sky whenever stuff happens during your playstyle. The biggest change that you will have with this, if you haven't seen the hero talent so far, is with the first point, which is Light's Guidance, making Wake of Ashes transform into Hammer of Light once you have casted it. And Hammer of Light is actually a consumer ability that blasts the target for a lot of damage. A bit disappointing was the fact that this is not an actual visual hammer. It kind of looks like a holy flame strike that a fire mage would probably do. The interesting bit is that it's a nice feedback and gameplay loop with Wake of Ashes generating holy power and then Hammer of Light consuming holy power. A minor gripe with this, although it could come down to a lack of experience or just playing it for the first time, Hammer of Light consumes 5 holy power, while Wake of Ashes generates 3 holy power. And most of the time you cast Wake of Ashes when you have no holy power or maybe 1 holy power. Hardly ever will you cast it at 2, especially if you're running Crusading Strikes, because you don't want to overcap or waste the eventually generated holy power in the future. So it ends up sometimes that you cast Wake of Ashes and you are at 4 holy power and you cannot cast Hammer of Light, so you have to generate 1 again. Not a big thing, but it is something to be mentioned. And since I just mentioned the Greater Judgment being able to be stacked, Undisputed Ruling, which is one of the hero talents you'll have access to, makes Hammer of Light apply judgment to its target and increase your haste by 15% for 6 seconds, which is something that you really kind of want for Templar. And this was very obvious when I tested it in a dungeon with the character templates that we have access to on the alpha, unfortunately bringing me to about 10% overall haste with the gear that I had on, which felt terrible for Templar. It was so obvious and it felt like all the haste buffs that I got just changed the game completely. It's very likely that you will want to stack haste, maybe mastery, or haste, maybe crit on your red coming into war with. And I would be surprised if you would play without haste at all when gearing your Templar. And part of the Templar kit is Imperium Hammers, which is pretty much half, if not the majority of your hero talents. Just calling down these little hammers flying from the sky is just additional damage. It's cool, but it's mostly passive. And outside of the little gameplay of Wake of Ashes into Hammer of Light into managing your holy power properly, Red pretty much plays the same. And it does play the same for Herald of the Sun as well, which maybe that's great because for Red is fun and people like playing Red. And the original intention of the hero talents was not to overly drastically change how your spec plays, but to kind of add a little bit of depth, which fair enough, it actually does for Ret Paladin, both hero talents, but specifically Herald of the Sun, which doesn't sound as cool as Templar because Templars are cool and they have been in our history and you know what a Templar is. However, Herald of the Sun feels way better to play. The visuals are kind of still on par, maybe a little bit less impactful than Templar. You don't have that many hammers and explosions, but you do have little lines and a lot of other stuff that happen as you play Herald of the Sun, because a lot of it is also passive. However, it does feel better to play. And if we're going to be talking about how impactful it is for your rotation, maybe it is a little bit more than Templar, because first of all, you have the talent called Aurora, which makes it so that after you cast Wake of Ashes, you get Divine Purpose, giving you 2 back-to-back finishers, which is great, and also implies that before you cast Wake of Ashes, you kind of always want to have 2 charges or 2 stacks or 2 applications of Greater Judgment on your target, aka casting Judgment at least once before, so that at least one of the finishers is going to be buffed, or 2 if you play High Lord's Wrath in the spec talent tree. Another thing to keep in mind is Second Sunrise, where your Divine Storm and Hammer of Wrath have a 15% chance to be cast again at 30% effectiveness, which are little procs of your abilities kind of echoing on your target. Not to mention that you have Blessing of Anshe, which makes your damage and healing abilities over time effects have a chance to increase the damage of your next Hammer of Wrath by 200% and make it usable on any target. Kind of like Sudden Death for warriors, giving you a use of Hammer of Wrath. So you have these little procs all throughout your rotation to give you a little bit of like, oh, I gotta press this button now, which is a little bit more than what Templar is doing at the moment. And because I had so little haste when I tested this on the alpha, I felt the talents such as Solar Grace, where your haste is increased by 4% for 12 seconds each time you apply Dawn Light. Multiple stacks may overlap, giving you a much bigger haste pool overall throughout your rotation, which is a little bit more consistent than the haste that Templar awards. And it just felt a little bit better. Now, once you have your Ret Paladin gear, then you actually have a baseline good amount of haste. Maybe this won't matter as much, but with pretty poor gear and pretty poor haste stats, this felt just faster and better to play, which usually translates into late game as well. End game, when you're like really decked out in really good gear, really high levels of haste and all of the other secondary stats, usually this also still feels better. There is one problem with Herald of the Sun, which, to be fair, is the only problem that I have found in my short playthrough of both the hero talents and the actual spec rework, and that is Eternal Flame. Eternal Flame replaces Word of Glory. That's it. It actually does nothing for Retribution Paladin. I understand that Herald of the Sun is supposed to be the joint child of Red and Holy, but I don't care about Eternal Flame as a Red Paladin, and because it obviously still costs holy power. But let me exchange an olive branch. I would care about the Eternal Flame if the off-heals haven't been neutered into the ground. And this is probably something that was done intentional, because we all know that hybrids are actually healing themselves for quite a bit right now in Dragonflight, and that is a problem when they're designing dangerous encounters that are supposed to provide a threat to our HP bar and kind of makes healers useless a lot of the time, where you see people doing content with no healers. I understand that, and it makes sense to tune down the healing of hybrids in general, the sustain of every other class except the healer. However, the numbers right now on the alpha, intended or not, are terribly low, like I'm not healing even for 10% of my HP with a Word of Glory, and you're giving me a talent that replaces it and is supposed to be stronger because it leaves a little hot afterwards. That is not very exciting to play. It doesn't impact my rotation at all. Maybe actually make Eternal Flame actually do Dragonfly levels of off-spec healing, which would probably make it a little bit more interesting. Still, I would not be super excited to take it because as Ret Paladin, I want to do damage. But I'll meet you halfway there, since this is the talent tree that's supposed to be shared with a healer spec. So a little bit of sustain is not necessarily a problem, since we see this with other classes like Monk as well, where it shares their talent tree, or the hero talent tree rather, with Mistweaver. It was incredibly fun to play Ret on the alpha, and it made the Ret currently that we love even better, with potentially some actual complexity coming into alpha in the War Within. And if you're interested in finding more about these classes, we already have Mountain Thane up on our channel right now for Protection Warrior, and see exactly if the King of the Mountains is for you, and thunderclapping your way to victory and many loots.